The room was still clapping when my son raised his glass and decided to bury me alive in front of everyone I had spent 40 years respecting. He smiled at the investors, at his wife, at the board members, and said, "My mother gave me a roof, but success was mine. She never understood business. She never understood ambition." A few people laughed because rich rooms always laugh when the cruelest person is holding the microphone. I did not move. I did not correct him. I only rested my hand over the folder inside my purse, the one with the emails, the signed guarantees, the shareholder records, and the one screen he never expected to see behind him. Chase thought he was ending my story that night. He had no idea I had brought the final chapter with me. Welcome back to Revenge Stories, where family betrayal does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it walks in wearing a tailored suit and calls itself success. This is a story about public humiliation, hidden ownership, quiet revenge, and the kind of justice that does not need to scream to destroy a lie. But before that ballroom screen lit up, before my son's perfect smile began to crack, let me take you back to the day I first realized he was not just ashamed of me. He was preparing to erase me. For 38 years, I had been the kind of woman people noticed only when something went wrong. My name is Raina Keller, and I spent most of my adult life inside offices where fluorescent lights buzzed, coffee tasted burnt by 10 in the morning, and every emergency somehow landed on my desk because I was the person who knew where the money was, where the contracts were, and which promise had been made behind which closed door. I started as a payroll clerk when I was 23, became a finance manager before 40, and retired as the operations director of a regional development firm that handled properties, contracts, and private investment deals across 3 states. It was not glamorous work. There were no red carpets, no interviews, no glossy magazine profiles. But that kind of work teaches a person how power really moves. Power does not always wear the loudest suit. Sometimes power is the woman in sensible shoes who reads every page before signing anything. Chase used to understand that. When he was little, he would sit at the kitchen table with his math homework while I spread invoices and budget sheets around my dinner plate. His father left when Chase was 9, not with a dramatic confession or a terrible fight, but with the slow cowardice of a man who had already packed his love away long before he packed his suitcase. After that, it was just the two of us in a small brick house on Alder Street, with a roof that leaked over the hallway closet and a furnace that made a sound like it was arguing with itself every winter. Chase hated that house because it reminded him we were not rich. I loved it because every payment I made on it meant nobody could take it from us. That was the difference between us, even then. He wanted a life that looked impressive. I wanted a life that could survive. I never raised him to be helpless. I taught him to balance a checkbook, to read a contract, to ask what a person wanted before accepting what they offered. But somewhere between business school and his first leased sports car, Chase began mistaking my sacrifices for evidence that I was small. He stopped saying we when he talked about his success. He began saying, "I built this." At first, I let it pass because mothers have a dangerous habit of explaining away the first signs of disrespect. We call arrogance confidence. We call neglect being busy. We tell ourselves a child will come back to gratitude when life humbles him. But life did not humble my son. Money made him louder. The company was called Keller Row, though most people assumed Chase had built it from nothing, because that was the story he loved telling in rooms full of expensive watches. It began as a small property management idea he brought to me when he was 28, standing in my kitchen with tired eyes and a folder of projections he did not fully understand. He had found 2 undervalued commercial buildings near a medical district, and he was convinced that if he could lease them to clinics and private practices, he could turn the investment into something real. The problem was that no bank wanted to lend him the money. His credit was thin, his experience was thinner, and his confidence was not collateral. I remember him sitting across from me, tapping his fingers on the table, saying, "Mom, I know this can work. I just need one person to believe in me." He looked like the boy who once brought me a broken toy and trusted me to fix it. So I did what mothers do before they learn the price of being needed. I believed. I did not hand him cash blindly. I was not foolish. I set up a family trust, invested through it, guaranteed the first loan, and required a controlling interest until the company became stable. Chase was impatient with the paperwork, but he signed because he needed me. I remember Graham Lawson, the attorney who drafted the documents, looking at me over his glasses and asking if I understood what this arrangement meant. I told him I understood perfectly. It meant my son got a chance without getting a blank check. It meant I could protect him from himself if ambition started moving faster than judgment. Chase laughed when I said that and kissed my cheek. "You worry too much," he told me. Maybe I did. But every clause Graham wrote later became a door I could lock when my son tried to push me out. For the first 2 years, Chase called me every week. He asked about lease language, vendor bids, tax exposure, insurance, payroll structure, tenant improvements, and investor presentations. Sometimes he called from his office at midnight, overwhelmed and angry, and I would talk him through the problem until his breathing slowed. I never asked for public credit. I never wanted to be on his social media posts, never wanted my name on the lobby wall, never wanted him to announce that his mother had quietly kept the whole thing from collapsing during its first winter. I wanted him steady. I wanted him proud. I wanted him to become the kind of man who could hold success without turning it into a weapon. Then Brielle entered his life like a chandelier lowered into a room that already had enough light. She was beautiful, polished, and careful with every word in a way that made compliments feel like negotiations. The first time Chase brought her to dinner, she looked around my kitchen and said, "This is charming," with the same tone a person might use for a museum exhibit. She asked if I still worked full-time, then smiled and said, "That must be exhausting at your age." Chase laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because he wanted her to see he was not offended on my behalf. That was the first small cut. Not deep enough to bleed, but sharp enough to remember. After they married, the cuts became cleaner. Chase stopped inviting me to business dinners because, according to Brielle, the tone of those evenings mattered. He stopped mentioning the trust because, according to him, investors preferred a simple origin story. He began calling my experience old school whenever I questioned a risky move. When I warned him not to overextend on a luxury redevelopment project, he said, "Mom, this is not your filing cabinet world anymore." I remember standing in his glass office, looking at the skyline behind him, and realizing the view had convinced him he was taller than he was. Still, I kept calm. Anger can make people dismiss you. Silence makes them underestimate you. The first real warning came 6 months before my retirement party. I had gone to Keller Rowe's office to sign an amended insurance document because one of the properties still listed my trust as the guarantor. Nobody expected me that morning. The receptionist, a nervous young man named Ethan, told me Chase was in a meeting and asked if I wanted to wait. I did, mostly because I had spent too many years arriving early to everything to start wandering around like a guest in a building my money had helped secure. From the waiting area, I could see the conference room through frosted glass, and I heard my son's voice when the door opened for coffee. He sounded irritated. He said, "My mother is not a problem. She just likes to feel included. Once the retirement party is over, we'll clean up the structure and move forward without all this emotional baggage." Emotional baggage. That is what he called the woman whose pension-backed guarantee had opened his first bank door. I did not react. I looked down at the magazine in my lap and turned a page I had not read. A moment later, Brielle's voice floated out, smooth as cream and twice as cold. "You need to stop letting her name sit near yours. It makes the company look inherited, not earned. Another man, probably Darren Pike, Chase's partner, said, "The board will support a restructuring if you frame it as modernization." Then Chase said the sentence that changed something permanent inside me. "After the party, she'll be too embarrassed to push back. She hates conflict." He was right about one thing. I did hate conflict. I hated waste, noise, cruelty, and all those theatrical storms people create because they cannot manage their own shame. But I did not hate consequences. Consequences had paid my bills. Consequences had raised my son. Consequences had taught me that if you sign a document, keep a copy. If you make a promise, remember the witness. And if someone calls you weak because you stayed quiet, you let them keep talking until they confess the shape of their own trap. I left the office that day without signing the amended document. Chase called me that evening and asked if I had stopped by. I told him I had, but the meeting seemed important. He said, "Sorry, Mom, things are moving fast." I said, "I noticed." That night, I opened the safe in my home office for the first time in nearly a year. Inside were the original trust papers, loan guarantees, shareholder agreements, capital contribution records, emails, handwritten notes, and board consents that told the real story of Keller Rowe. I did not cry when I touched them. I did not feel triumphant either. What I felt was colder than sadness and cleaner than anger. I felt awake. For years, I had protected Chase from the consequences of being unprepared. Now he was preparing to turn my protection into his personal myth. He wanted the company, the story, the money, the credit, and the dignity of looking self-made. He wanted me present only as a prop at my own retirement party, an aging mother he could praise lightly before pushing aside permanently. That was when I called Graham Lawson. Graham had known me for 20 years, long enough to understand that I did not make dramatic phone calls. When I asked for a private review of the Keller Rowe trust structure, he did not waste time with comfort. He simply said, "Do you believe Chase is attempting to remove your control?" I looked at the stack of papers on my desk and answered, "I believe he is attempting to remove the truth." Graham was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Those are different battles, Raina. The second one is usually uglier." He was right. Money fights can be settled with numbers. Truth fights require light. Over the next 4 months, I became exactly what Chase believed I was too old to be. Careful, patient, invisible. I requested complete financial records through the trust, which I had every legal right to do. I asked Graham to review every amendment Chase had proposed in the last 2 years. I had an independent accountant examine transfers, management fees, personal reimbursements, and expenses marked as business development. The first report came back with red flags, not enough to accuse him publicly, but enough to make my stomach tighten. Keller Rowe had paid for private club memberships, luxury travel that did not match business calendars, a consulting fee to a shell vendor connected to Darren, and a brand residence lease that looked suspiciously like Chase and Brielle's downtown apartment. Every time my son stood in a room and said he had built everything himself, he was standing on invoices I had never approved. I also found the emails. That was the part that hurt more than the money. Money can be replaced. Words stay. Chase had written to Darren that my ownership was a sentimental obstacle. Brielle had emailed a PR consultant asking how to minimize the mother narrative before a potential investor feature. In another chain, Chase complained that I had become too attached to legacy control and said the retirement party would create the perfect emotional moment to transition her out gracefully. Gracefully. That word almost made me laugh. They were planning to humiliate me with applause. They wanted the room softened by music, champagne, and nostalgia so nobody would notice the knife. I told only one person besides Graham, my friend, Nova Bennett. Nova and I had met in a women's leadership seminar back when both of us were young enough to be mistaken for assistants in rooms where we were the most prepared people present. She was blunt, loyal, and allergic to cowardice. When I showed her the emails, she read them twice, then pushed the papers back across my dining table and said, "Tell me you are not going to let him hug you on stage after this." I told her I had not decided what I was going to do. She stared at me the way only an old friend can stare, with love sharpened into impatience. "Raina, that boy is not confused. He is rehearsing." I looked at the file between us and said, "Then I suppose I should rehearse too." The retirement party was Chase's idea, though he presented it as a gift. He booked the Meridian Hotel ballroom, hired a photographer, arranged a string quartet for the entrance, and invited people from my old company, Keller Rose Investors, board members, vendors, and several acquaintances I had not seen in years. At first, I thought he was trying to look generous before making his move privately. Then I saw the guest list and understood the real design. It was not just my retirement party. It was his stage. If he could make me look small in front of everyone who mattered, any later challenge from me would seem like bitterness from an aging mother who could not let go. He wanted witnesses for the version of me he was about to create. 2 weeks before the party, Chase came to my house with Brielle. He had not visited in months, and the sight of his car in my driveway made the old mother in me foolishly hopeful for half a second. He walked in wearing a navy coat that probably cost more than my first car, kissed the air near my cheek, and said the house looked exactly the same. Brielle carried a white garment bag and placed it over my sofa like she was covering evidence. "We brought you something for the party," she said. Inside was a pale gray dress with a stiff collar and a shapeless cut that would have made me look like a retired librarian in a charity brochure. I looked at it, then at her. She smiled and said, "It is dignified, understated. We do not want you feeling overwhelmed by all those executives." Chase added, "Just trust Brielle on presentation, Mom. She knows these rooms." I almost said, "So do I." Instead, I thanked them. Not because I planned to wear it, but because people reveal themselves more honestly when they believe you accept the role they picked for you. Chase sat in my living room and spoke about the party schedule as if briefing an employee. There would be a slideshow of my career, he said, a few remarks from my former colleagues, and then his speech. When he mentioned his speech, Brielle touched his arm with a small, satisfied smile. I asked if I could say a few words at the end. Chase hesitated, just for a beat, then said, "Of course. Something short and heartfelt." He meant harmless. I heard it clearly. After they left, I hung the gray dress in the back of the closet and took out the emerald suit I had bought for myself. It was tailored, simple, and expensive in the quiet way I preferred. I had bought it after my first major promotion and worn it only once, on the day I negotiated a contract with 3 men who thought I was there to take notes. By the end of that meeting, 2 of them were sweating through their collars and the third asked for my card. Clothes do not make a person powerful, but sometimes they remind the person wearing them who she was before someone tried to shrink her. The night of the party, I arrived 20 minutes early with Nova at my side and the folder in my purse. Graham was already there, seated near the back with a leather briefcase under his chair. Vincent Hale, one of Keller Rowe's most important investors, stood near the bar speaking with 2 board members. Chase believed Vincent admired him. The truth was more complicated. Vincent had invested in Keller Rowe because he trusted my due diligence, my structure, and my guarantee. He liked Chase's energy, but he trusted my caution. That difference would matter before the night ended. The ballroom was beautiful in the expensive, impersonal way hotel ballrooms often are. White flowers, gold lighting, round tables, linen so crisp it looked ironed by fear. On the large screen behind the stage, my name appeared in elegant letters, celebrating Raina Keller, a lifetime of service. I stood there for a moment, reading the words, feeling the strange grief of being honored by people who had been invited to watch me be diminished. Chase crossed the room when he saw me, and for 1 second his smile faltered. He had expected the gray dress. Brielle's eyes moved over my emerald suit, my hair, my pearl earrings, and the small gold watch I had bought with my first bonus. Her expression tightened before she recovered. "You look bold," she said. I smiled and answered. Retirement seemed like the right time. Dinner passed with practiced warmth. People hugged me, told stories, asked about my plans. Some of them meant it. Some were already drifting toward Chase's orbit, where the future seemed shinier. I watched my son work the room, laughing with investors, leaning close to board members, placing one hand on his wife's back as if they were the lead couple in a film about success. He was good at performance. I had taught him confidence, but somewhere along the way, he had learned theater. When the first speaker took the stage, I folded my hands in my lap. A former colleague praised my discipline. Another thanked me for saving a project years earlier. A younger woman I had mentored cried while describing how I had helped her negotiate her first raise. That nearly broke me, not because it was sad, but because it was evidence that I had not imagined my own worth. Then Chase walked to the microphone. The applause was loud. He waited for it to settle, smiling with his chin slightly lifted. He looked handsome, composed, almost tender. For a moment, I saw the boy at the kitchen table again, the one who needed help with fractions and believed I could fix anything. Then he began to speak, and the boy disappeared. He thanked everyone for coming. He called me the foundation of our family, in the soft voice people use before delivering an insult wrapped in gratitude. He said I had worked hard in traditional spaces and had done my best with the tools of her generation. Her, not my mother. Her generation. Brielle watched from the front table, lips curved. Chase continued, and the room shifted. "My mother taught me discipline," he said, "but she never really understood risk. She never understood scale. Keller Row was not built by caution. It was built by vision, by late nights, by refusing to stay small." A few people nodded. He glanced at me, then back at the audience. There were times, honestly, when I had to push past the fear I inherited. I had to stop asking permission from people who only knew how to survive, not how to win. That landed like a slap, but I did not move. My face stayed calm. Inside, something old and tender folded itself away. Then he raised his glass. "So tonight, while we honor my mother's service, we also celebrate a transition. She can finally rest. She can stop worrying about things she no longer needs to understand. And Keller Row can step fully into the future." There it was. Not an announcement, not yet, but a signal. A public framing. He wanted the room to hear that I was past tense, retired, emotional, limited, loved perhaps, but no longer relevant. The applause that followed was hesitant at first, then stronger because people are trained to clap when a powerful man pauses. I saw Nova's hand tighten around her napkin. I saw Graham lower his eyes to his briefcase. I saw Vincent Hale stop smiling. Chase was not finished. He turned slightly toward me, and his voice took on that warm cruelty that works best in public because it leaves the victim no graceful way to protest. "Mom, you gave me a roof. You gave me rules. But success was mine. You never understood business. You never understood ambition. And that is okay. Not everyone is built for the future." Laughter flickered across the room, not from everyone, but enough. Brielle laughed first. Darren followed. Some guests looked at their plates. Others looked at me with pity, which was almost worse. My son had not only insulted me, he had invited strangers to agree with him. I looked at him and felt something very still settle behind my ribs. It was not rage. Rage is hot and careless. This was precise. This had dates, signatures, exhibits, and a prepared HDMI connection. Chase lifted his glass higher, expecting me to smile through the wound. I did smile, but not the way he wanted. I gave him the kind of smile a banker gives a man whose check has already bounced. When the applause faded, he stepped down from the stage and leaned close as he passed my chair. Under the noise, he murmured, "Please do not make this emotional." I touched the folder in my purse and said quietly, "I was about to ask you the same thing." The host announced that I would now say a few words. Chase's eyes sharpened because he had expected something short and harmless. I stood slowly, not because I was weak, but because I wanted the room to watch me rise. Nova squeezed my hand before letting go. I walked to the stage with the folder under my arm. Every step felt strangely peaceful. The lights were warm on my face. The microphone waited. Behind me, the screen still displayed my name, Celebrating Raina Keller. I looked at those words, then at my son, who sat beside Brielle with a frozen smile. He still thought the night belonged to him. I began gently. I thanked everyone for coming. I thanked my former colleagues for their kindness. I said retirement makes a person reflective, and reflection can be uncomfortable because it asks what we built, what we protected, and what we allowed. Chase shifted in his chair. I saw him glance toward the event coordinator, perhaps wondering if the microphone could be cut without looking suspicious. I continued before he could decide. "My son is right about one thing," I said. "Keller Row was built on risk, but he seems to have forgotten whose risk it was." The room became very quiet, not silent yet, just alert. I turned slightly toward the screen. The event coordinator, a young woman Chase had hired, looked terrified until Graham stood from the back and handed her a small drive. She plugged it in because lawyers have a way of making simple movements feel mandatory. The title slide appeared, Keller Row Capital Structure and Founding Records. A murmur moved through the ballroom. Chase stood halfway, then stopped. Brielle whispered something to him. I did not look at her. I looked at the audience. "I had planned to make a warm speech tonight," I said. "Then my son chose honesty as the theme of the evening, so let us be honest." The first document appeared, the original bank guarantee. My name, my trust, my signature. The amount that had made Chase's first acquisition possible. I explained that when Keller Row began, Chase did not qualify for the loan he now described as his first brave move. The bank had declined him twice until my trust secured the debt. I did not say it with bitterness. I said it the way I used to present quarterly numbers. Clearly, calmly, without decoration. The second slide showed the capital contribution ledger. My retirement savings, my investment, my majority ownership. 51% held through the Raina Keller Family Trust, with voting rights reserved until a formal release that had never been signed. The room no longer murmured. It listened. Chase moved toward the stage then, but Vincent Hale stood before he reached the first step. Vincent did not raise his voice. He simply said, "Let her finish." It was astonishing how quickly power recognizes power. Chase stopped. His face had gone pale under the ballroom lights. Brielle's hand was on his sleeve, her perfect nails digging into the fabric. Darren stared at his phone as if searching for an exit inside the screen. I turned to the third slide. Emails. Not all of them. I was not cruel for entertainment. I was precise for necessity. The first email showed Chase referring to my ownership as a sentimental obstacle. The second showed Brielle asking how to minimize the mother narrative. The third showed Darren discussing a restructuring after the retirement party. I heard someone gasp softly. It might have been the woman I had mentored years ago. It might have been me, finally hearing the betrayal outside my own head. Chase said, "Mom, this is private, loud enough for the front tables to hear." I looked at him and answered into the microphone, "So is my sacrifice." The sentence landed harder than I expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. For a second, I saw something flicker in his eyes. Shame, maybe? Or only fear dressed as shame. He opened his mouth again, but Graham stepped to the side of the stage and placed a formal notice on the podium. That was when the night moved from exposure to consequence. Graham introduced himself as counsel for the trust and explained that, under the existing operating agreement, any attempt to restructure Keller Rowe without trust approval was invalid. He further explained that the trust had completed a review of company expenditures and governance conduct, and that effective immediately, I was exercising my majority voting rights to suspend Chase Keller from executive authority pending investigation by independent counsel and the board. He said all of this in the dry, careful voice lawyers use when destroying a person with nouns. The audience sat frozen. The photographer lowered his camera. The string quartet, somewhere near the sidewall, looked like they regretted learning music. Chase finally lost his performance. He stepped toward the microphone, face tight, and said I was confused, that I had misunderstood normal business planning, that I was letting retirement emotions cloud my judgment. He called me mom in that pleading tone adults use when they want the privileges of childhood without the accountability of adulthood. I let him speak for a few seconds because the room needed to hear him reach for the same story he had used to shrink me. Then I opened the folder and removed the final page. Chase, I said, 3 months ago, you drafted a resolution to remove the trust's voting protections by claiming I was no longer mentally or professionally fit to oversee complex financial matters. You asked 2 board members to support it after tonight. I looked toward the screen as the document appeared. Would you like to explain that misunderstanding too? That was the moment Brielle stood. She did not look cold anymore. She looked furious in the way people look when the servant in their imagination refuses to remain one. She said, "This is humiliating." I looked at her, and for the first time that evening, I allowed my voice to sharpen. Yes, Brielle, that was the plan. It simply changed direction. A few people lowered their eyes, not out of embarrassment for me, for her. She sat down slowly, the color rising in her cheeks. Chase stared at the screen, trapped between denial and math. He knew the documents were real. He knew the signatures were real. He knew the clauses he had ignored were suddenly standing in front of him wearing my face. But I was not done. Revenge, when it is only humiliation, burns out quickly. Justice requires repair. I told the room that I had no interest in destroying Keller Rowe because too many employees had done honest work there, and too many tenants relied on its stability. My issue was not with the company. My issue was with the lie that one man's ambition had created what many people, including the mother he mocked, had built. I announced that Vincent Hale had agreed to serve as interim oversight chair during the investigation. Vincent stood and gave a small nod. That nod cost Chase more than any insult I could have spoken. Investors understand signals. That nod told the room where confidence had moved. Then I announced the part Chase never saw coming. My personal estate plan had been revised. Any inheritance Chase expected from my home, my savings, my trust distributions, or my eventual sale rights had been redirected into the Keller Women's Advancement Fund, a scholarship and emergency grant program for women entering finance, operations, and property management without family wealth behind them. I did not do it to punish him with charity. I did it because I had spent my life opening doors for a son who slammed one in my face. Now I would open doors for daughters who would not be ashamed of the hands that helped them. Chase whispered, "You cannot do this." It was not a legal argument, it was a child's protest. I looked at him, and for the first time that night, I felt the ache beneath the coldness. He was still my son. That was the cruelty of it. Revenge did not erase the years when I had packed his lunches, checked his fever, waited up during storms, and bought sneakers one size too big because I needed them to last through the school year. It did not erase the boy. It only answered the man. I already did, I said, not loudly. You were copied on the notice last week. You did not read it because you thought anything from me could wait. That sentence broke something in the room. People understood it. Not the legal details, perhaps, not the trust structure or the voting rights, but the human truth. He had not read my message because he had trained himself to believe I was background noise. He had built an empire of self-image on the assumption that his mother would always absorb the insult and keep the lights on. The email had been sitting in his inbox for 7 days. So had the formal notice. So had the request for voluntary cooperation. He had ignored all of them. Then he had put on a suit, entered a ballroom, and called me obsolete. The party ended badly for him and quietly for me. There was no screaming, no thrown glass, no dramatic collapse. The most devastating endings are often administrative. Board members gathered near Graham. Investors avoided Chase's eyes. Darren slipped out through a side door before dessert. Brielle demanded the car, then left without waiting for her husband. Chase remained near the stage, staring at the dark screen after the documents were removed. When I stepped down, he caught my arm. Not hard, just desperate. He said, "Mom, we should talk privately." I looked at his hand until he released me. "We had years to talk privately," I said. "Tonight you preferred an audience." Nova walked me to the lobby. She did not cheer. She did not say I had won. She simply put her arm through mine, and we walked past the floral arrangements, past the guest book, past the framed photo Chase had chosen of me from 15 years earlier because he preferred me softer, younger, easier to package. Outside, the air was cool enough to feel honest. I stood beneath the hotel awning and let myself breathe. My phone buzzed again and again. Messages from former colleagues, from board members, from people who had seen enough to understand that the night had not been a scene, it had been a correction. 3 days later, Keller Rowe's internal investigation began. Chase hired his own attorney, of course, and for a while he tried to frame everything as a family disagreement that had gotten emotional. That might have worked if the records had been vague. They were not. The independent review confirmed unauthorized personal expenses, governance violations, and attempts to alter control without proper approval. Darren resigned before the board could remove him. Brielle deleted several social media posts about being the wife of a self-made founder, though screenshots survive longer than vanity expects. Chase was not led away in handcuffs. That was never my goal. But he was removed as CEO, stripped of signing authority, and required to repay misused funds through a structured settlement that emptied more than one account he had enjoyed showing off. The business press wrote about it for a week. Not national headlines, but enough. Founder suspended after governance review. Family trust reclaims control of Keller Rowe. Retired finance executive revealed as majority stakeholder. Chase hated the last one most. It corrected the myth. For years, he had allowed people to call him founder without mentioning the foundation. Now every search result attached my name to his success and his downfall. I did not give interviews. I did not need to. The documents had already spoken, and unlike people, documents do not get nervous. A month after the party, Chase came to my house. Not the downtown apartment, not the office, not a restaurant where he could manage the lighting and the exits. My house. The small brick one on Alder Street, with the repaired roof and the furnace I had finally replaced after telling myself for 10 winters that it could survive one more. He stood on the porch looking younger than he had in years and worse than he probably imagined. No tailored confidence, no audience. Just a man with tired eyes and a mother behind a locked screen door. He said, "I know I hurt you." I looked at him through the mesh and waited because apologies often begin with truth and end with excuses. He continued. He said he had been under pressure, that investors expected confidence, that Brielle had pushed image strategy, that Darren had made the restructuring sound normal, that he had not meant the speech to sound so cruel. I listened. Not because I believed all of it, but because once I had listened to his breathing at midnight while he panicked over lease terms, and some habits of love do not die cleanly. When he finished, I said, "You did not humiliate me because you were pressured, Chase. You humiliated me because you believed the room would reward you for it." His face changed. That was the sentence he could not step around. He asked if there was a way back. Not to the company first. To me. I wish I could say that question gave me satisfaction. It did not. It gave me grief with a pulse. I told him there might be a way back to decency, but not to the old arrangement where I paid the cost of his character development. I told him he would have to complete the settlement, cooperate with the investigation, issue a written correction to investors, and attend counseling if he wanted any personal relationship with me. He stared as if I had handed him a contract instead of a boundary. Maybe I had. Love without terms had taught him nothing. Love with consequences was the only language left. He did not hug me when he left. I did not ask him to. He walked down the porch steps slowly, and for a moment I remembered him at 10 years old, dragging a backpack almost bigger than his shoulders, turning back to wave before school. I let that memory pass through me without letting it make my decision for me. That is one of the hardest lessons of motherhood, though I would never put it in a speech. Sometimes the child you protected becomes the adult you must protect yourself from. And sometimes protecting yourself is the first honest gift you have given them in years. Keller Rowe survived. Better than survived, actually. Without Chase performing greatness at every meeting, the company became quieter and more functional. Vincent helped stabilize investor confidence. Graham tightened governance. We promoted a woman named Alana Brooks, who had been doing half of Chase's real operational work without the title or salary to match. She became interim president, then permanent president after 6 months. The first time she sat at the head of the conference table, she looked at me and said, "I hope I do not disappoint you." I told her, "Do not perform for me. Read everything. Ask questions. Keep your promises. That will be enough." She smiled like a person who had been given permission to lead without pretending. The scholarship fund launched the following spring. We gave the first grants to 12 women, some young, some starting over, some mothers, some daughters of mothers who had worked themselves invisible. At the opening event, there was no ballroom cruelty, no hidden slideshow, no son with a glass in his hand trying to rewrite history. There were folding chairs, coffee, nervous laughter, and women holding envelopes that meant rent, tuition, certification fees, childcare, transportation, one more chance. Nova sat beside me and cried without apology. I did not cry until a woman in her 40s told me she had postponed her accounting certificate 3 times because everyone else's needs came first. She said, "This makes me feel like someone saw me." I had to look away then. Being seen can arrive late and still matter. Chase sent a letter after that. A real one, handwritten, with no attorney copied and no careful corporate phrasing. He admitted he had been ashamed of the version of success that needed help. He admitted he had allowed Brielle and Darren to feed an insecurity that was already there. He admitted the speech had been prepared, not accidental. That mattered. He did not ask for money. He did not ask for control. He asked if, someday, he could take me to lunch and hear the full story of how Keller Rowe was actually built. I read the letter twice, then placed it in a drawer. I was not ready. Forgiveness is not a door people get to kick open because they finally found the right words. It is a key the wounded person may or may not choose to use. Brielle filed for separation before summer. I heard about it from Graham because her attorney contacted his office regarding certain financial disclosures tied to the apartment lease. I felt no triumph. Brielle had been cruel, but she had not created Chase. She had only decorated the worst parts of him and called them ambition. Darren tried to start another venture and discovered that investors have long memories when money is involved. Vincent told me once, over coffee, that the ballroom night would become a private legend in business circles. I told him I hoped not. He laughed and said, "Raina, people love a public downfall." I answered, "They should love a private correction more." But I knew he was right. The world enjoys spectacle. I had used that truth once, and once was enough. A year after my retirement party, I returned to the Meridian Hotel for a scholarship dinner. Same ballroom, different flowers, different screen, different woman standing at the microphone. This time, my name was not displayed as a sentimental decoration. It appeared under the words, Founder, Keller Women's Advancement Fund. I almost objected to founder because the word had caused enough trouble in my family, but Nova told me to stop being dramatic and accept accurate nouns. So I did. I stood on the stage and looked out at the faces of women, donors, students, mentors, and colleagues who knew the corrected story. Not the gossip version, the real one. A mother was humiliated by her son in public. She answered with proof. Then she built something better from the wreckage. Chase came that night. He stood in the back, alone, wearing a plain dark suit and no visible arrogance. I had not invited him, but I had not forbidden him either. When my speech ended, he clapped softly. He did not approach me until most people had gone. Then he walked over and said, "You were good up there." I looked at him, waiting for the old instinct to twist the compliment into something about himself. It did not come. He only added, "You always were." That was the first sentence from him in years that did not seem to be asking for anything. I nodded and said, "Thank you, Chase." It was not reconciliation, not yet, but it was not war either. People sometimes ask, though never directly, whether I regret exposing him at my own retirement party. They expect a complicated answer because mothers are supposed to suffer beautifully. They expect me to say I wish I had handled it privately, wish I had protected his reputation, wish I had swallowed the insult and corrected him later behind closed doors. But privacy was the curtain he chose for betrayal. Public admiration was the weapon he raised against me. He did not make a mistake in a kitchen. He made a performance in a ballroom. So I answered in the same room, under the same lights, before the same witnesses. That was not cruelty. That was balance. I do regret one thing. I regret teaching him for too long that my love could be used as an emergency fund for his character. I regret every time I softened a consequence because he looked tired. I regret every moment I let his embarrassment become my silence. But I do not regret the folder. I do not regret the screen. I do not regret the look on his face when the truth stepped into the room and took the microphone from him. Retirement did not become the quiet ending Chase had planned for me. It became the first chapter of a life where I no longer had to make myself smaller so my son could feel self-made. I still live in the brick house on Alder Street. The roof does not leak anymore. The furnace runs quietly. On my desk, beside the scholarship letters, I keep a framed copy of the first bank guarantee I signed for Keller Rowe. Not because I miss the pain attached to it, but because it reminds me of the difference between sacrifice and surrender. Sacrifice gives from strength. Surrender hands someone the knife and apologizes for bleeding. My son once stood in a room full of people and said, "I never understood ambition." Maybe he was right. I never understood the kind of ambition that requires you to erase the person who lifted you. I never understood success that needs a mother to look foolish so a son can look powerful. But I understand records. I understand timing. I understand ownership. And I understand this. When someone builds their throne on your silence, you do not have to shout to take it apart. Sometimes you only need to stand up, open the folder, and let the receipts speak for themselves. Commentary time. Let's pull the curtain back on Raina Keller's story, because what happened in that ballroom was bigger than a dramatic family confrontation. On the surface, yes, it looked like a son humiliating his mother at her own retirement party and then getting exposed with documents, emails, and ownership records. But underneath that scene was something far more painful. A woman watching the person she raised turn her love into something he could use, hide, and eventually deny. Chase did not simply disrespect his mother. He attempted to edit her out of his success story, and that kind of betrayal has a very specific cruelty to it. It is not loud at first. It does not always begin with screaming. It begins with small corrections, small omissions, small moments where someone stops saying we and starts saying I, until one day they are standing in front of a room full of people claiming they built a life on their own, while the person who carried the first weight is sitting right there, expected to smile. What makes this story so powerful is that Raina does not react like someone who is desperate to be believed. She reacts like someone who already has the truth in her hands. That difference matters. A desperate person argues. A prepared person waits. Chase wanted her to look emotional, outdated, fragile, and maybe even slightly confused. That was the whole design of his speech. If she interrupted him, he could call her dramatic. If she cried, he could call her unstable. If she left, he could say she could not handle change. But Raina understood the room better than he did. She knew that in a place filled with investors, board members, and professionals, the most powerful language was not pain. It was proof. So she let him talk. She let him build the lie high enough for everyone to see it clearly. Then she brought out the foundation he had been standing on. And that is where I think the revenge becomes especially satisfying. It was not random. It was not petty. It was not a mother trying to embarrass her son because her feelings were hurt. Her feelings were hurt, absolutely. But that was not the only issue. Chase was laying the groundwork to remove her influence, rewrite the company's origin, and transform her legal protection into a sentimental inconvenience. In other words, he was not only attacking her dignity, he was attacking the structure she built to protect both the company and him. That is why the folder mattered. That is why the slideshow mattered. That is why Graham standing there with formal notices mattered. The revenge worked because it was disciplined. It did not ask the room to pity her. It required the room to acknowledge reality. Now think about Chase's speech for a second. He did not walk to the microphone and say, "My mother supported me, and I am grateful, but it is time for me to lead." That would have been honest, even if complicated. Instead, he framed her as someone who only knew survival, not ambition. He made her caution sound like fear. He made her experience sound like obsolescence. That is an old manipulation tactic. Take the very quality that saved you and rename it as weakness. Raina's caution secured the loans. Raina's discipline created the trust. Raina's attention to detail kept the company legally protected. But when Chase wanted to appear self-made, those same strengths became obstacles in his mouth. He needed her to look small because his myth depended on it. And let's not skip over the public nature of what he did. Public humiliation is not just private cruelty with witnesses. It is a strategy. When someone humiliates you in front of others, they are trying to recruit the room into their version of the story. Chase wanted the applause to do part of the damage for him. He wanted the guests to laugh, nod, and absorb the idea that Raina was loved, but no longer relevant. He wanted social pressure to make her silence look graceful. That is why her response had to be public too. Some people may say, she should have handled it privately because he was her son. But he did not choose a private battlefield. He chose the ballroom, he chose the microphone, he chose the audience. When a lie is performed in public, truth has the right to enter through the same door. So let me ask you honestly, if someone publicly reduced you to a footnote in your own sacrifice, would you still owe them a private correction? Where does loyalty end and self-erasure begin? Because that is the emotional center of this story. Raina loved Chase. She remembered him as a child. She remembered the homework, the old house, the late nights, the business dream he brought to her kitchen table. But love does not mean you must keep funding someone's disrespect. Love does not mean you must protect a false image that was built by stepping on your name. At some point, protecting the person who betrayed you becomes participating in the betrayal against yourself. One thing I admire about Raina is that she never loses control of the room. Chase has polish, but Raina has command. Those are not the same thing. Polish is what you learn when you want to impress people. Command is what you develop when you have carried responsibility for decades and do not need theatrics to prove you belong. Chase knows how to work a crowd. Raina knows how to read one. He understands performance. She understands pressure. He thinks confidence is volume. She knows confidence can be quiet enough to make everyone lean in. That is why the moment she stands up, the energy changes. She does not have to attack him. Her calmness itself becomes the warning. Brielle's role also deserves attention, because she is not just the stylish daughter-in-law standing on the sidelines. She represents a particular kind of social cruelty, the kind that hides inside taste, branding, and presentation. From the beginning, Brielle treats Raina like an aesthetic problem. The house is charming. The dress should be dignified. The mother narrative should be minimized. That is not accidental language. Brielle is trying to manage Raina the way someone manages an outdated logo. She does not see her as the woman who made the company possible. She sees her as an image risk. And that is why her humiliation is so deserved when the documents appear. She wanted to polish Raina out of the frame, only to discover Raina owned the frame, the picture, and the wall it was hanging on. But we should also be careful not to blame Brielle for everything. Chase was not innocent clay shaped by his wife. He already had the insecurity. Brielle simply gave it a luxury vocabulary. Darren gave it a business excuse. The board members gave it silence. The room gave it nervous laughter. But Chase made the choice. That matters. People love to outsource their moral failures when they get caught. They say they were influenced, pressured, advised, manipulated, misunderstood. But a person's character is revealed by what they are willing to do when ambition offers them a reward. Chase was willing to embarrass his mother to look bigger. That was his decision. Nobody forced him to raise that glass. And that brings us to one of the sharpest emotional truths in the story. Shame can make people cruel to the very people who helped them. Chase is ashamed of needing help. He is ashamed of the small house, the early failures, the loan rejections, the trust structure, the fact that his mother had to secure the door before he could walk through it. But instead of growing mature enough to say, "I had help, and I am grateful," he chooses the easier lie, "I did it alone." That lie may sound powerful in a speech, but it is emotionally bankrupt. There is nothing weak about being helped. Every successful person has been helped by someone, whether they admit it or not. The weakness is not in receiving support. The weakness is in becoming too proud to honor it. The American obsession with being self-made plays a huge role here. We love the clean story. We love the founder who started with nothing. We love the speech about grit, hustle, long nights, and vision. And yes, hard work matters. Vision matters. Risk matters. But the honest version of success usually includes more names than the person holding the microphone wants to mention. It includes parents, spouses, teachers, mentors, employees, guarantors, assistants, friends, and people whose labor never made it into the headline. Chase wanted the myth without the receipts. Raina brought the receipts. That is why the story hits so hard. It punctures a fantasy many people are encouraged to perform. There is also a quiet tragedy in the fact that Raina did not want public credit for years. She was not hungry for applause. She did not demand her name on the wall. She did not insist that every investor dinner begin with a tribute to her. She was content to help from the background because her goal was not admiration. Her goal was stability. But that is where generous people sometimes get trapped. When you do not ask for recognition, ungrateful people may decide you do not deserve any. When you make support look effortless, entitled people may assume it costs you nothing. When you stay quiet to preserve someone else's pride, they may start believing their pride is proof that you were never important. So here is a question for the audience. Was Raina partly responsible for letting Chase build that false story for so long? Not responsible for his betrayal, of course. The betrayal belongs to him. But did her silence create the space where his ego could grow unchecked? This is where the story becomes more complicated and more human. Many parents protect their children from embarrassment, even adult children. They cover mistakes. They soften failures. They give money without making it public. They fix problems quietly. That can be love. But when love never asks for accountability, it can become a place where entitlement feels safe. Raina's mistake was not helping Chase. Her mistake was believing gratitude would naturally survive success. The party scene is devastating because it is not the beginning of the betrayal. It is the moment the betrayal becomes visible. Chase had already been moving away from her emotionally. He had already minimized her privately. He had already planned to restructure her out. The speech simply exposed what had been happening behind closed doors. That is often how betrayal works. The public wound is shocking, but it is usually the final expression of something that has been growing in private for a long time. By the time someone humiliates you openly, they have usually rehearsed their disrespect internally. Raina realizes that. She understands that his words are not a slip. They are a strategy. And I love that her revenge does not depend on begging the room to understand her pain. She does not say, "How could you do this to me?" She does not list every sacrifice through tears. She does not try to make herself look wounded enough to earn sympathy. Instead, she lets the facts carry the emotional weight. The guarantee, the trust, the ownership percentage, the emails, the restructuring plan, the ignored notice. Each document says what she does not need to dramatize. This is why the scene feels cinematic without becoming melodramatic. The emotion is buried inside the evidence. That is a very strong storytelling choice because it respects the audience. We understand the heartbreak without being told how to feel. The line about the notice sitting unread in Chase's inbox is one of the most quietly brutal parts of the story. It tells us that his downfall was not only caused by arrogance in the ballroom, it was caused by years of assuming his mother could be ignored. He did not read the message because it came from her. He treated her voice as optional until her silence became legally impossible to ignore. How many relationships fall apart exactly like that? A person does not answer the call, does not read the message, does not take the warning seriously, does not respect the boundary. Then, when consequences arrive, they act surprised. But the truth is, the warning was there. They just did not respect the person delivering it. Vincent Hale's reaction is also important. When he stands and says, "Let her finish," he changes the balance of the room. Up until then, Chase still thinks status will protect him. He assumes the investors belong to his performance. But Vincent's calm support of Raina tells everyone that the old power map was wrong. Chase was not the sun. He was a bright object reflecting light from people he underestimated. That moment is subtle, but it matters because powerful people often survive consequences when the surrounding room protects them. Chase loses the room because the room finally realizes where the true authority has been sitting all along. Graham's role gives the revenge its legal backbone. Without him, the scene might have looked like a family argument. With him, it becomes governance. That distinction is crucial. Chase wants to frame everything emotionally because emotional conflict is easier to dismiss. He wants to say his mother is upset, confused, or hurt. Graham makes that impossible. He turns the spotlight away from feelings and towards structure, voting rights, operating agreements, trust approval, expenditure review, executive authority. Suddenly, Chase cannot hide behind the word family. He has to face the word accountability. That shift is what makes the revenge durable. It does not end when the party ends. It follows him into the company, the boardroom, and the settlement. I also think the scholarship fund is one of the most elegant choices Raina makes. She could have let the entire ending revolve around what Chase lost. Instead, she turns the recovered power into something that outlives the conflict. That is not sentimental. It is strategic and moral at the same time. She takes the legacy he expected and gives it to women who understand the value of being seen, supported, and trusted. That gives the revenge a second layer. Chase does not only lose access to money, he loses the story that the money was always meant for him. Raina reclaims her legacy and redirects it toward people who will not treat her generosity like an embarrassment. And let's talk about the idea of inheritance for a moment. Some people behave as if inheritance is a birthright, not a relationship of trust. Chase assumed that because Raina was his mother, her estate was his future property. That assumption is dangerous. Nobody is entitled to a legacy they actively dishonor. Family connection may create emotional bonds, but it does not erase conduct. If you humiliate, manipulate, and attempt to erase the person who built the estate, why should you automatically inherit the fruit of that estate? Raina's decision is harsh, but it is not irrational. It says, "You may be my son, but you are not entitled to be the final destination of everything I survived." The porch scene after the downfall adds emotional realism. Chase comes back, but not with full accountability at first. He brings explanations, pressure, Brielle, Darren, expectations, stress. This is exactly how many people apologize when they are not yet ready to fully face themselves. They approach responsibility sideways. They admit pain, but dilute intention. Raina sees through it. Her answer is not cruel, but it is precise. He humiliated her because he believed the room would reward him. That sentence strips away all the decorative excuses. It identifies the moral choice. He wanted the benefit of the cruelty. That is what he must face if he wants any real way back. What I appreciate is that Raina does not confuse apology with restoration. Chase saying the right words does not immediately reopen every door. That is a mature boundary. In stories, we often rush forgiveness because it feels emotionally satisfying to wrap everything up neatly. But real trust does not rebuild itself because the person who broke it finally looks sad. Raina gives him conditions. Cooperate, correct the record, repay what was misused, seek help, and stop expecting motherhood to function as a legal defense. That is not cold. That is healthy. She is not trying to punish him forever. She is refusing to protect him from the work required to become trustworthy. This is where the story speaks to anyone who has ever been manipulated by the phrase, "But we are family." Family can be sacred, but it can also be weaponized. When someone says, "We are family," only after consequences arrive, they are often not asking for reconciliation. They are asking for immunity. Chase did not remember family when he called her outdated in front of investors. He remembered family when he needed private damage control. That difference is everything. Raina still loves him, but she no longer allows the word son to erase the word responsibility. I want to pause on Raina's internal conflict, because it is easy to cheer for the revenge and forget the grief inside it. She wins, but she does not get back the son she thought she raised. That is the cost. Public justice can correct a lie, but it cannot restore innocence. After the documents, after the board action, after the inheritance change, she still has to go home with the memories. The little boy at the kitchen table, the first business plan, the late-night calls, the pride she once felt. Revenge may be satisfying, but it does not make betrayal painless. The story is powerful because it allows both truths to exist. Raina needed to expose him, and exposing him still hurt. That emotional complexity is what keeps her from becoming a flat revenge character. She is not a cold mastermind who stopped caring. She is a mother who finally decided that love without boundaries had become dangerous. That is a difficult decision, especially for parents. Parents are often expected to keep absorbing, keep forgiving, keep giving, keep believing that the adult child will eventually remember. But sometimes the adult child only remembers when the money stops, the documents appear, or the audience hears the truth. Raina's heartbreak is that she had to become publicly powerful to be privately respected. Now, here's another question. Did Chase truly change by the end, or did he simply lose enough to behave better? The story leaves that slightly open, and I like that. His handwritten letter matters because it is less polished. It does not involve lawyers. It does not ask for control. It admits the speech was prepared. That is a real step. But a step is not a destination. The fact that Raina puts the letter away instead of immediately responding is important. She is not performing forgiveness for the audience. She is allowing time to test whether his humility is genuine. That restraint is just as powerful as the ballroom exposure. Darren's fate is also fitting. He is the kind of person who thrives near arrogance, but vanishes near accountability. Every powerful ego has people like Darren nearby, partners, advisors, friends, consultants, people who encourage the worst idea as long as they might profit from it. He does not need to be the main villain to be morally responsible. He helped turn Chase's insecurity into a plan. He treated Raina as a technical obstacle rather than a person. And when the truth came out, he slipped away. That tells us everything about his loyalty. People who bond over exploitation rarely remain loyal when exposure begins. Brielle's separation from Chase is not surprising either. Their marriage, at least as shown in the story, was partly built on status performance. Once the performance collapsed, the relationship lost much of its oxygen. That does not mean she had no feelings, but it does suggest that she was invested in the version of Chase that looked powerful, self-made, and socially clean. When the truth made him complicated, indebted, and publicly diminished, she left. There is a poetic justice in that. Chase tried to erase the woman who helped him become impressive, and then the woman impressed by his image left when the image cracked. One of the most meaningful transformations in the story is what happens to Keller Rowe after Chase is removed. The company does not collapse. In fact, it becomes healthier. That matters because Chase had convinced himself he was indispensable. Many arrogant leaders do this. They confuse visibility with value. They think because they are the face of the company, they are the company. But often, the real strength is in the systems, the workers, the quiet operators, and the people who actually understand how things function. Alana Brooks stepping into leadership proves that Chase was not the only possible future. He was just the loudest version of it. Alana's promotion is also a meaningful echo of Raina's life. Raina spent years being the prepared woman in rooms where men underestimated her. Now she gets to promote another woman who has been doing the work without the title. That is not just a business decision, it is narrative repair. Raina cannot rewrite what Chase did, but she can prevent the same invisibility from continuing under her watch. This is where the story becomes more than revenge. It becomes succession done correctly. The person who was once erased now becomes the person who recognizes others before they are erased too. The emerald suit is a small detail, but it carries symbolic weight. Chase and Brielle bring her the gray dress because they want to costume her as harmless. They want her visually softened, muted, retired, manageable. Raina chooses the emerald suit from a time when she knew exactly who she was. That choice is not vanity. It is self-recognition. Before she says a word, she refuses the role they assign to her. Sometimes dignity begins with something as simple as not dressing for the version of yourself your enemies prefer. And the setting matters too. A retirement party is supposed to be a celebration of a life's work. Chase tries to turn it into a controlled exit. That is why the revenge feels almost ceremonial. He attempts to stage her removal at the very event meant to honor her, so she transforms that ceremony into a correction. The ballroom becomes a courtroom without a judge. The screen becomes a witness stand. The microphone becomes a ledger. It is cinematic because every object in the scene changes meaning. The party decorations are still there, but the truth changes the room.